When 7-year-old Marcus Thompson's regular babysitter called in sick, his mother had no choice but to trust the replacement sent by the agency. With impeccable references and a polished smile, Ms. Victoria Blackwood seemed perfect. But behind closed doors, a darkness lurked beneath her professional facade, one that would spark an unexpected revolution in how we protect our children, and prove that sometimes the smallest stars shine the brightest. 7-year-old Marcus Thompson was a walking ray of sunshine. His dimpled smile could light up any room, and his teacher called him a math wizard for his ability to solve complex problems that challenged even the older kids. Dr. Sarah Thompson, his mother, and respected pediatric surgeon, had raised him to be proud, confident, and kind, qualities that seemed to radiate from him naturally. But on this particular summer morning, as Dr. Thompson prepared for an emergency surgery that would keep her at the hospital for 12 hours, she felt an unfamiliar unease. Her regular babysitter, Mrs. Green, had called in sick, and the agency had sent a last-minute replacement, Ms. Victoria Blackwood. "Your credentials seem impressive," Dr. Thompson said, reviewing the agency's file. Ms. Blackwood had 15 years of experience and glowing references. Her starched white blouse and perfectly coiffed gray hair projected an image of professional competence. "I assure you, doctor, your son will be in capable hands," Ms. Blackwood replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I've handled many similar situations." Something in her tone made Dr. Thompson pause, but the hospital was already calling. A child's life hung in the balance, waiting for her surgical expertise. She had no choice. "Marcus, honey," she called upstairs, "come meet Ms. Blackwood." Marcus bounded down the stairs, wearing his favorite NASA t-shirt and clutching a book about space exploration. "Hi, Ms. Blackwood. Want to see my science project? I'm building a model of the solar system." Ms. Blackwood's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "How enthusiastic." Dr. Thompson knelt to hug her son. "Mrs. Martinez next door has my number, and she'll be checking in. Be good, sweetheart. I love you." "Love you too, Mom. Don't worry, I'll teach Ms. Blackwood all about Neptune's moon." As Dr. Thompson's car pulled away, she didn't see how quickly Ms. Blackwood's demeanor changed. She didn't see her son's excited expression falter as his new babysitter's warm facade dissolved. "First rules," Ms. Blackwood announced, closing the door firmly. "No running in the house, no loud noises. You will address me as ma'am, and," she glanced distastefully at Marcus's spacebook, "we'll be focusing on more appropriate activities." Marcus's small hands tightened around his book. "But Mom says learning about science is always appropriate." "Your mother isn't here," Ms. Blackwood replied coldly. "In my experience, children like you need structure, not stories about flying to the moon." The way she said "children like you" made Marcus feel suddenly small, despite being tall for his age. He'd heard that tone before. At the park when some kids wouldn't let him join their game, or at the store when a woman had pulled her purse closer as he passed. But Marcus remembered what his mother always told him. Your mind is your superpower, and nobody can take that away. The morning started with Ms. Blackwood assigning him to clean his already tidy room. When he finished quickly, showing her the perfect hospital corners on his bed, a trick his mom had taught him, she frowned. "Missed a spot," she said, deliberately knocking his carefully arranged solar system model off the shelf, styrofoam planets scattered across the floor. "Oops," she said, without a hint of regret. "Better clean that up too. And since you clearly have too much time on your hands, the baseboards need dusting." While Marcus worked, he could hear her on the phone in the living room. "No, nothing like my usual charges. Doing my best with what I have to work with. These assignments are always more challenging." Mrs. Martinez, their next-door neighbor, chose that moment to check in. But Ms. Blackwood was prepared. As soon as the doorbell rang, her voice transformed back into syrupy sweetness. "Oh, Marcus is just finishing his lunch," she told Mrs. Martinez. "Such a good appetite. We're having such a wonderful time." In reality, Marcus hadn't been offered lunch yet, despite it being well past noon. His stomach growled as he carefully reconstructed his solar system, making sure each planet was the correct distance from his papier-mâché sun. Mrs. Martinez, a retired teacher with sharp eyes and an even sharper intuition, noticed something was off. She saw Marcus's usually neat hair was disheveled, and his NASA shirt had dust marks from cleaning. Most tellingly, he hadn't come running to show her his latest space facts, something he did every time she visited. "Marcus, honey," she called past Ms. Blackwood. "Everything okay?" Before Marcus could answer, Ms. Blackwood stepped into his line of sight, her back to Mrs. Martinez. The look she gave him was clear. Say anything, and things would get worse. "Yes, Mrs. Martinez," Marcus said quietly. "Everything's fine." But Mrs. Martinez had taught elementary school for 30 years. She'd developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and every instinct was now screaming that something was wrong. "Well," she said casually, "I might pop by again later, just to bring those cookies I promised." Ms. Blackwood's smile remained fixed. How thoughtful, but we wouldn't want to spoil his dinner. As soon as Mrs. Martinez left, Ms. Blackwood turned to Marcus. "Cleaning clearly isn't keeping you busy enough. Let's see about your schoolwork." She rifled through his backpack, pulling out his math workbook. Her eyebrows rose as she saw the advanced problems he was solving, work meant for students several grades above his level. "Impossible," she muttered. "You must be cheating somehow." "I'm not," Marcus protested. "Mom helps me study. I'm going to be a scientist like Katherine Johnson. She helped NASA calculate spaceflight trajectories and—" "Enough!" Ms. Blackwood snapped. "More of this space nonsense. In my day, children knew their place. They didn't have such inappropriate aspirations." She tore out several pages from his workbook. "Start over, and this time, do problems suitable for your level." Marcus felt tears welling up, but refused to let them fall. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "You are brilliant, you are worthy, and nobody can dim your light." Meanwhile, Mrs. Martinez was making calls, first to other neighbors, gathering observations, then to her daughter, a lawyer, finally to a friend who worked at the babysitting. What she learned was disturbing. Victoria Blackwood had indeed worked as a babysitter for 15 years, but her real record was carefully hidden. There had been complaints, quiet ones that never made it into her official file, always about her treatment of certain children, always dismissed because the parents couldn't prove anything, and Ms. Blackwood was so good at presenting a professional image. But Mrs. Martinez had seen enough. She knew she needed evidence and a plan. Mrs. Martinez knew she had to be strategic. Direct confrontation might make things worse for Marcus, and without evidence, it would be Ms. Blackwood's word against her suspicions. She needed to document what was happening while ensuring Marcus's immediate safety. She called another neighbor, Mr. Jackson, a retired security consultant who had installed the neighborhood's camera systems. "Remember when you offered to upgrade my home security?" she asked. "I think we need it today, and make sure the backyard cameras have a clear view of the Thompsons' windows." While Mr. Jackson worked quickly but discreetly to set up surveillance, Mrs. Martinez contacted Dr. Thompson's hospital. She didn't want to panic the doctor during surgery, but she left a detailed message with the head nurse. Non-emergency, but requires attention when possible. Inside the Thompson house, the situation was deteriorating. Ms. Blackwood had moved on to lunch, a barely edible sandwich she'd made, while preparing a gourmet meal for herself. She ate at the dining table while making Marcus sit on the kitchen floor. "Children need to learn gratitude," she said, cutting into her perfectly prepared chicken breast. "In my experience, certain children especially need to learn their place in the world." But Marcus, despite his young age, understood exactly what was happening. His mother had prepared him for moments like this, though she'd hoped he'd never face them. "Mom says my place is wherever my dreams can take me," he said quietly but firmly, remembering their conversations about dignity and self-worth. Ms. Blackwood's face darkened. "Your mother has filled your head with dangerous ideas. When I was growing up, people knew the natural order of things." She stood up suddenly, moving toward Marcus with dangerous intent, but a knock at the door interrupted her. It was Mr. Chen from across the street, carrying a telescope. "Marcus!" he called out cheerfully. "Remember you asked to see Jupiter's moons? Perfect weather today." Before Ms. Blackwood could object, Mrs. Martinez appeared behind Mr. Chen. "Oh, wonderful. The astronomy club meeting. We shouldn't waste this clear sky." She turned to Ms. Blackwood with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You don't mind if we set up in the backyard?" Dr. Thompson mentioned Marcus's interest in astronomy during the neighborhood meeting. Ms. Blackwood was trapped. Refusing would look suspicious, and she could tell these neighbors were watching her carefully. "Of course," she said through gritted teeth, "but only for a short while. Marcus has lessons to complete." As they set up the telescope in the backyard, more neighbors casually appeared. Mrs. Patel brought samosas, claiming they were perfect astronomy snack. Mr. Jackson adjusted his security cameras while pretending to be interested in the stars. Even teenage Kevin from down the street showed up, wearing his junior police cadet uniform and taking careful notes about astronomical observation. Marcus felt the protective circle forming around him, just as his mother had always said it would. "Our community is our strength, baby. When good people stand together, love always wins." But Ms. Blackwood wasn't finished. During a moment when the neighbors were focused on Jupiter's moons, she grabbed Marcus's arm roughly, pulling him toward the house. "Enough of this nonsense. Time for your lessons." What she didn't realize was that Mr. Jackson's cameras caught everything. Mrs. Martinez's daughter, the lawyer, was already reviewing the footage remotely, and Dr. Thompson's surgery was finishing up. The head nurse had made sure Dr. Thompson got the message as soon as she left the operating room. "Check on Marcus." Neighbors concerned, Evidence collected. Dr. Thompson, still in her surgical scrubs, called Mrs. Martinez immediately. When she heard what had been happening to her son, her voice became steel. "I'm on my way. Call the police. And Helen," she added, referring to Mrs. Martinez by her first name. "Thank you for being his guardian angel." But before Dr. Thompson could leave the hospital, she received another call, this one from the babysitting agency's owner, Mrs. Chen's sister. The evidence Mr. Jackson had collected had already been sent to them, along with a detailed history of similar incidents compiled by Mrs. Martinez's lawyer daughter. "Dr. Thompson," the agency owner said, her voice heavy with responsibility, "we've been trying to catch Ms. Blackwood for years. Other families complained, but she was careful never to leave evidence. She preys on single parents, especially minorities, counting on their busy schedules and lack of resources to protect her. But your neighbors, they've given us everything we needed. The police were already on their way, but the neighborhood wasn't waiting. As Ms. Blackwood tried to drag Marcus inside, Mrs. Patel stepped forward. "More samosas?" she asked innocently, deliberately blocking the path. Mr. Chen suddenly needed help adjusting the telescope. Kevin had questions about space that only Marcus could answer. Each neighbor created a buffer between Marcus and his tormentor, a human chain of protection. Ms. Blackwood began to realize she was losing control. She could see Mrs. Martinez on the phone, Mr. Jackson reviewing his camera footage, and the growing number of neighbors in the yard. Her carefully constructed facade was cracking. The wail of police sirens pierced the evening air. Ms. Blackwood's face, already pale, turned ashen as two patrol cars pulled up to the Thompson residence. Officer Rivera, a veteran of the force, stepped out first, followed by her partner, Officer Chen, no relation to the telescope-wielding neighbor. "Victoria Blackwood," Officer Rivera called out, her voice steady and professional. "We need to speak with you." Ms. Blackwood's transformation was immediate and desperate. The mask of professional competence slipped back into place like a shield. "Officers, I can explain everything. These neighbors have been interfering with my duties all afternoon. I'm simply trying to provide structure and discipline." "Save it for the station," Officer Chen interrupted, holding up his phone. "We've reviewed the security footage, and the agency has just sent over some very interesting historical documentation." As the officers approached, Ms. Blackwood made one last attempt to maintain control. She grabbed Marcus's shoulder, plastering on a sympathetic smile. "Marcus, dear, tell them what a wonderful day we've had. Tell them how much you've learned about proper behavior." But Marcus stood tall, just as his mother had taught him. "My mom says lying is wrong," he stated clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And she also says that bad people count on good people being too scared to tell the truth." At that moment, a familiar car screeched into the driveway. Dr. Thompson exploded out of the driver's seat, still in her surgical scrubs, her face a storm of controlled fury. She ran to Marcus, wrapping him in her arm. "Baby, are you okay? Did she hurt you?" "I'm okay, Mom," Marcus said, hugging her tight. "I remembered everything you taught me, and the neighbors. They were like my guardian angels." Ms. Blackwood tried one last time. "Dr. Thompson, surely you understand the need for discipline. Some children require a firmer hand." "Some children?" Dr. Thompson's voice could have cut diamond. "You mean black children, don't you, Ms. Blackwood? Say it clearly. Own your prejudice." The neighborhood had grown eerily quiet. Even the birds seemed to be listening. "I've dealt with people like you my entire career," Dr. Thompson continued. "People who see my son's skin color and try to dim his light, who look at his brilliant mind and try to break his spirit, who think children like my Marcus need to be put in their place instead of lifted to the stars where they belong." She turned to the officers. "I want to press charges, and not just for today. We need to find every family she's done this to, every child she's tried to break." Officer Rivera nodded. "We already have 3 other families willing to come forward, thanks to your neighbor's investigation. Mrs. Martinez and her daughter have been quite thorough." As the officers led Ms. Blackwood to the patrol car, she finally lost her composure. "You don't understand. These children need to learn. They can't just think they can be anything they want. In my day—" "Your day is over," Mrs. Martinez interrupted firmly, "and good riddance to it." After Ms. Blackwood was taken away, the neighbors didn't disperse. Instead, Mrs. Patel brought out more samosas. Mr. Chen resumed the astronomy lesson. Kevin, the junior police cadet, sat with Marcus and asked him to explain black holes. Dr. Thompson watched in amazement as her yard became an impromptu celebration of her son's resilience and their community's unity. Mrs. Martinez approached her with tears in her eyes. "I failed my students once," the retired teacher admitted. "Years ago, I suspected another child was being mistreated, but I didn't have proof. I didn't know what to do. I've carried that guilt ever since. Today, I wasn't going to fail again." The story might have ended there, with a bad person arrested and a community drawn closer together. But Marcus, with his brilliant mind and beautiful heart, had other ideas. "Mom," he said that evening as the last neighbors were leaving, "I want to do something, so other kids don't have to go through this." Dr. Thompson looked at her son, marveling at his strength. "What are you thinking, baby?" Marcus's eyes shone with purpose. "Well, first we need to talk to your lawyer friend." What followed would change not just their community, but the entire childcare system in their state. The Marcus movement, as it came to be known, started with a simple idea from a 7-year-old boy. Every child deserves guardian angels. Working with Mrs. Martinez's daughter, Lisa, the lawyer, Dr. Thompson and Marcus began creating what would become the Guardian Angel Network. The first meeting was held in their backyard, the same place where the neighborhood had come together to protect Marcus. "The problem," Lisa explained to the gathered neighbors, "is that these incidents often go unreported. Busy parents, especially single parents and minorities, are vulnerable to predatory caregivers. Ms. Blackwood isn't the only one. She's just the one who got caught." Marcus, sitting between his mother and Mrs. Martinez, raised his hand. "What if we made a special phone number, like 911, but for kids who need help?" The adults exchanged looks. Out of the mouths of babes. Within months, the Guardian Angel Hotline was launched as a pilot program in their city. It was staffed by trained volunteers, retired teachers like Mrs. Martinez, security experts like Mr. Jackson, and law students from Lisa's firm. They created a network of verified safe houses in every neighborhood, places where children could go if they felt threatened or uncomfortable with their caregivers. But Marcus wasn't done. During Ms. Blackwood's trial, where he bravely testified alongside other children she had mistreated, he noticed something. "Mom," he whispered during a recess, "some of the kids don't know they're special like you taught me." Ms. Blackwood made them believe the bad things she said. This observation led to the second phase of the Guardian Angel Network, the Starlight program, named after Marcus's love of astronomy. It paired children who had experienced discrimination or mistreatment with mentors who could help rebuild their confidence. Mr. Chen volunteered his telescope for regular astronomy nights, teaching children about the infinite possibilities of the universe and their own potential. Mrs. Patel started a cooking club where kids learned about different cultures through food. Kevin, the junior police cadet, developed a special self-defense class that taught children both physical safety and emotional strength. Dr. Thompson watched in amazement as her son's idea blossomed. The program caught the attention of state legislators who were working on a bill to reform child care licensing requirements. They invited Marcus to testify. Standing before the state assembly, wearing his NASA shirt and speaking with the clarity of pure conviction, Marcus shared his story. "Ms. Blackwood thought she could break me because of how I look," he said, his voice steady. "But my mom taught me that I'm worthy, I'm smart, and I can touch the stars. Every kid needs someone to teach them that. Every kid needs guardian angels." The Marcus Law, as it became known, passed unanimous. It mandated comprehensive background checks for child care workers, including investigating past complaints that hadn't resulted in formal charges. It established funding for community-based child protection networks and created strict new penalties for discriminatory treatment in child care setting. But perhaps the most profound change was happening in the hearts and minds of the community itself. The neighbors who had come together to protect one child discovered they could do so much more. Mrs. Martinez's living room became a homework help center, where struggling students found not just academic support, but emotional encouragement. Mr. Jackson taught parents and children alike about personal safety and the proper use of security technology. Lisa's law firm started offering free workshops on parents and children's rights. The babysitting agency, under Mrs. Chen's sister's leadership, underwent a complete transformation. They implemented a revolutionary screening process that included psychological evaluation and anti-bias training. Their new motto: "Every child is a star waiting to shine." 1 year after the incident, the Thompsons' backyard was once again full of people, but this time for a celebration. The Guardian Angel Network had expanded to 3 states, and Marcus was receiving a Children's Humanitarian Award for his role in creating it. As he stood before the crowd, his solar system model now permanently displayed in a place of honor, Marcus shared the lesson he had learned. Bad things happen when good people stay quiet, but amazing things happen when they stand together. Ms. Blackwood thought she could make me feel small, but instead, she made all of us realize how big we could be when we help each other. Dr. Thompson, watching her son inspire a new generation of activists and allies, remembered her own mother's words. Sometimes the worst day of your life becomes the day that changes everything for the better. The changes continued to ripple outward. Other communities began adopting the Guardian Angel model. As the Guardian Angel network expanded, something unexpected began to happen. The movement started attracting attention from an unlikely source: reformed discriminators. The first was a former preschool teacher named Margaret Wells, who approached Dr. Thompson after one of Marcus's speeches. With tears in her eyes, she confessed to having held similar prejudices to Ms. Blackwood throughout her teaching career. "Watching your son speak, it made me realize how many children I might have hurt with my old-fashioned views," she admitted. "I want to help make it right." This led to the creation of the Change Hearts program, where former prejudice caregivers who had acknowledged their biases worked to educate others and prevent discrimination. Margaret became its first speaker, traveling to child care centers and schools to share her journey of transformation. Meanwhile, Marcus had started middle school, where his experience fueled a new initiative. He and his friends created the Star Buddies program, pairing older students with younger ones to ensure no child felt vulnerable or alone during after-school hours. The program caught the attention of the Department of Education, and soon schools across the country were implementing similar peer protection systems. Marcus, now 10, found himself consulting with educational experts and child psychologists, helping them understand child protection from a kid's perspective. But the most powerful moment came 3 years after the incident, when Marcus received a letter from an unexpected source: Miss Blackwood's daughter. "Dear Marcus," the letter read, "I ran away from home at 18 because of my mother's hatred. I've spent years trying to undo the prejudices she taught me. When I saw you on the news, speaking about transformation and redemption, I knew it was time to help. I'm a teacher now, and I want to be part of your Guardian Angel network." The letter led to a new branch of the organization focused on breaking generational cycles of prejudice. Sarah Blackwood, who had changed her last name, became one of their most effective advocates, helping other children of prejudiced parents learn to choose love over hate. Dr. Thompson watched all of this with a mixture of pride and amazement. Her son's traumatic experience had sparked a national conversation about child care, racism, and community responsibility. But more importantly, it had created real change in everyday lives. The neighborhood itself had become a model community. The once simple astronomical gatherings in their backyard had evolved into a weekly Stars and Stories event, where families from all backgrounds came together to learn about both the universe and each other. Mrs. Martinez, now the national director of the Guardian Angel Network's education division, had developed a comprehensive training program for child care workers that went beyond basic certification. It included modules on cultural sensitivity, recognizing and addressing bias, and fostering inclusive environments. One day, while helping to organize a national conference for the Guardian Angel Network, Marcus made an observation that would lead to their next big initiative. "Mom," he said, looking up from his tablet where he was reviewing participation data, "we're helping kids stand up to prejudice, but what about helping them succeed afterward? Ms. Blackwood didn't want me learning advanced math or dreaming about NASA. There are probably lots of kids whose dreams got squashed before they could grow." This insight led to the creation of the Dream Accelerator program. Working with universities, tech companies, and various professionals, they established mentorship opportunities for children who had faced educational discrimination. The program's first success story was a girl named Jasmine, who had been told by a previous caregiver that girls like her shouldn't study engineering. Through the Dream Accelerator, she connected with a Black female NASA engineer who became her mentor. 3 years later, Jasmine's robotics project won the National Science Fair. The ripple effects continued to spread. Police departments across the country began adopting Officer Rivera's training program on recognizing and responding to child care discrimination. Mr. Jackson's security protocols became the standard for child care facilities nationwide. Lisa's legal framework for protecting vulnerable children was being studied in law school, but perhaps the most profound change was visible in the smallest moment. A child feeling confident enough to raise their hand in class, a parent knowing their community had their back, a caregiver examining and transforming their own biases. One evening, as Marcus helped Mrs. Martinez train a new group of Guardian Angel volunteers, she asked him if he ever felt angry about what had happened to him. Marcus thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I remember what Mom always says. When something bad happens, you have 3 choices. You can let it define you, let it destroy you, or let it strengthen you. We chose to let it strengthen not just me, but everyone around us." The volunteers nodded, many wiping away tears. Among them was a familiar face, Kevin, the former junior police cadet, now a full-fledged officer running his precinct's child protection unit. "You know what's amazing?" Kevin said. "We thought we were just protecting one kid that day. We didn't realize we were starting a revolution." As the Guardian Angel Network approached its 5th anniversary, they faced their biggest challenge yet. A series of high-profile cases across the country revealed a disturbing pattern of discrimination in prestigious private child care centers. These facilities, catering to wealthy families, had been quietly turning away or mistreating children of color despite their parents' ability to pay. Marcus, now 12 and increasingly aware of the complexities of systemic racism, recognized that this was different from his experience with Ms. Blackwood. "This isn't just about individual prejudice," he explained to the Guardian Angel Network's board of directors. "It's about institutions thinking they can hide behind their reputation." Dr. Thompson, who had recently been appointed to a presidential commission on the child care reform, saw an opportunity. "Sometimes," she told Marcus, "you have to change the system from the inside." They launched Operation Excellent, a multi-pronged initiative that would become their most ambitious project yet. The plan was to create a certification program so rigorous and prestigious that any child care facility would want it, but make anti-discrimination practices and cultural competency absolute requirements for certification. Lisa, now a leading civil rights attorney, helped design the legal framework. "The genius," she explained, "is that we're not just punishing bad behavior, we're rewarding excellence in inclusion." The program required facilities to maintain staff diversity at all levels, provide continuous cultural competency training, implement blind admission processes, create culturally inclusive curricula, establish parent-community oversight board. But Marcus added one more requirement that proved revolutionary. Every certified facility had to participate in STAR Students Exchange Program, where they provided scholarships to underserved children from their local communities. The resistance was immediate, fierce. Several prestigious centers claimed the requirements were too burdensome or compromised their institutional culture, but they hadn't counted on the power of the network Marcus had helped build. Mrs. Martinez activated their parent advocacy groups across the country. Mr. Chen, whose technology company had become a major force in educational software, offered free digital compliance tools to participating centers. Kevin, now a police captain, helped create security protocols that protected all children while avoiding discriminatory profiling. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Blackwood, Ms. Blackwood's daughter, had become a renowned expert in early childhood education. Her research definitively proved that inclusive child care centers produced better outcomes for all children, regardless of background. "Diversity isn't just a moral imperative," she testified before Congress. "It's an educational advantage. Children in truly inclusive environments show higher emotional intelligence, better problem-solving skills, and stronger academic performance." The publication of her findings in major educational journals created a tipping point. Parents of all backgrounds began demanding Guardian Angel certification for their child care provider. Centers that had initially resisted found themselves losing enrollment to more inclusive competitors. Meanwhile, Marcus had been quietly working on a personal project. He'd noticed that many children who had faced discrimination, like himself, struggled with telling their stories. With help from Mr. Jackson's tech team, he created an app called Star Stories. The app provided a safe space for children to share their experiences through art, poetry, or prose. Each story was reviewed by child psychologists before being anonymously shared, creating a powerful testament to both the reality of discrimination and the resilience of children. One story particularly touched Marcus. It was from a girl whose experience mirrored his own, but who hadn't had a community to protect her. She wrote about feeling alone and powerless until she found the Guardian Angel Network. Now she was leading her school's Star Buddies program. "You see," Marcus told his mother, reading the girl's story, "it's like a constellation. Each star might seem alone, but when you connect them, they tell a story and light the way for others." The Star Stories app became a powerful tool for education and advocacy. Teachers used it to help students understand discrimination from their peers' perspectives. Lawmakers cited the stories when drafting child protection legislation. Most importantly, children using the app found they weren't alone. As the Guardian Angel Network's influence grew, they began receiving international attention. Representatives from other countries started reaching out, asking for help, implementing similar programs in their communities. Dr. Thompson watched with pride as her son, now preparing to enter his teens, handled video calls with child advocates from around the world. The scared 7-year-old who had faced down prejudice had grown into a confident young leader who was helping others find their voice. But Marcus never forgot what had started it all. In every new Guardian Angel Network location, the first installation was always a telescope. Because, he would explain, sometimes kids need to see how big the universe is to understand how big their own potential can be. One evening, during a global virtual gathering of Guardian Angel Network members, a young participant asked Marcus if he ever thanked Ms. Blackwood. Marcus considered the young participant's question carefully before answering. The virtual gathering fell silent, hundreds of faces on screens around the world waiting for his response. "Thank Ms. Blackwood?" he repeated thoughtfully. "No, I've never thanked her, but I do acknowledge how her actions changed me. Changed all of us. Sometimes the people who try to break you end up making you unbreakable." He gestured to the wall behind him, where his original solar system model still hung, now accompanied by pictures of Guardian Angel Network, chapters from around the world. "Look at what her hatred built. A global network of love and protection. Look at how many stars are shining now, because we refuse to let anyone dim their light." 10 years had passed since that summer day when a prejudiced babysitter had tried to break a little boy's spirit. Ms. Blackwood had served her time and, according to Sarah, had begun showing signs of change after watching from prison as her former victim transformed the child care landscape. The Guardian Angel Network had grown beyond anything they could have imagined. Over 10,000 certified child care centers across 6 continents, more than 1 million children protected by Star Buddies programs, countless lives touched by their advocacy and support. Dr. Thompson, now the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, had helped implement Marcus's protection protocols as national policy. Mrs. Martinez had trained a new generation of educators in cultural competency and child advocacy. The neighborhood that had once come together to protect one child had become a model for communities worldwide. But perhaps the most powerful legacy was in the smallest moments. A child feeling safe enough to dream big. A caregiver examining their biases and choosing to change. A community learning to stand together against injustice. At 17, Marcus was preparing to head to college. MIT had already offered him a full scholarship to study astrophysics, but before he left, he had one last project to complete. The Guardian Angel Network's 10th anniversary celebration was held in the same backyard where it all began. Participants joined virtually from around the world as Marcus unveiled their newest initiative, the Phoenix Program, designed to help reform discriminators become advocates for change. "My mother taught me that hurt people," Marcus explained to the gathering, "but healed people heal people." Even Ms. Blackwood's story doesn't have to end with hatred. Every person has the capacity to change, to choose love over fear, understanding over ignorance. The program's first participant, Victoria Blackwood herself, who, under her daughter Sarah's guidance, had spent her post-prison years confronting her prejudices and working to make amends. "I can never undo the pain I caused," she wrote in a letter read by Sarah at the ceremony, "but I can spend the rest of my life helping to prevent others from causing similar harm." Marcus didn't just survive what I did. He turned it into a force for global change. He proved that even the darkest situations can inspire the brightest light. As the sun set on the celebration, Marcus and his mother stood in their backyard, just like they had so many years ago. The telescope Mr. Chen had used to protect him was still there, now accompanied by dozens more, ready for another community stargazing session. "You know what I've learned, Mom?" Marcus said, adjusting one of the telescopes. "The universe doesn't just show us how small we are, it shows us how connected we are. Like stars in a constellation, we're all part of a bigger picture, and when we shine together, we create something beautiful." Dr. Thompson hugged her son, tears in her eyes. And to think, it all started with a little boy who wouldn't let anyone tell him he couldn't reach the stars. Above them, the first stars of evening began to appear. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a child laughed. In community centers around the world, Guardian Angel volunteers prepared for another day of protecting dreams. And in countless homes, children looked up at those same stars, knowing they had guardians watching over them, ready to help their lights shine bright. For in the end, the greatest victory over darkness isn't just surviving it, it's transforming it into light that helps others find their way. And sometimes, the smallest stars shine the brightest, lighting the path for generations to come.